It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of everyday life. A small group of friends, 5 in total, decided to camp by a secluded lake deep in the woods. The location was remote, far away from the usual camping sites. It was the kind of place where the world felt far away, where all you could hear was the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves and the G. As the sun began to set, the group gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. The flames crackled and danced, casting long shadows that flickered and shifted in the growing darkness. The firelight felt like a comforting shield against the unknown that surrounded them. But as the night stretched on, something began to feel off. The first incident happened around midnight. One of the friends, Mark, stepped outside the tent to relieve himself. As he walked away from the campfire, the sounds of the forest seemed to fall away. The air grew colder and the usual forest noises, chirping insects and rustling leaves, fell eerily silent. Mark paused, his heart racing. A strange feeling crept over him, one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not his own, but slow, deliberate steps crunching on the forest floor. They seemed to echo, even though there was no one around. Mark froze, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He squinted into the darkness, trying to make out any movement, but saw nothing. There were no other campers nearby, and the footsteps were too distinct to belong to an animal. Mark quickly returned to the camp, his pulse pounding in his ears. He didn't say anything to the others at first, but they could all tell something was wrong. As the night wore on, the atmosphere became thicker, heavier. The air felt charged, like something was watching them from just beyond the firelight. But things didn't stop there. The next morning, the group woke up to an unsettling sight. There were footprints, bare footprints, around the camp. They circled the tents, coming too close to where they had been sleeping. The prints didn't look like they belonged to any of the group. They were too large, too wide, and they were bare, leaving deep impressions in the dirt. The most chilling part? The footprints appeared to have been walking in and out of their tent, as though someone had been standing just outside, watching them while they slept. But none of them had heard anything during the night. There was no sound of footsteps, no disturbance in the campsite. It was as though whatever, or whoever, had been there was careful to leave no trace of their presence, except for these unsettling footprints. Panic began to set in. The group was no longer sure what to believe. Was it a prank? But who could have done it? There was no one else around for miles. The nearest campsite was miles away, and no one had driven past them. The unease in the air was palpable, but they tried to push the fear aside and finish their trip. Later that night, Mark found himself lying awake in his sleeping bag. The fire had long since died down, and the others were asleep. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the very darkness around them had come alive, breathing with a life of its own. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A rustling sound outside their tent, followed by a slow, deliberate step. Mark's heart skipped a beat, and his body tensed. The sound grew closer, and he could almost feel the presence just outside the tent, breathing in the dark. He held his breath, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound. Then, he heard a whisper. Barely audible, but there. It was a voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably human. It spoke his name. Mark. He froze, wide-eyed, unable to move or speak. The voice had come from directly outside the tent, but the others were all asleep inside, oblivious to what was happening. The night dragged on, filled with the eerie sounds of the forest, the whispers, and the unexplainable footsteps. When morning came, the group hurriedly packed up and left. They didn't speak much during the ride home, the weight of what had happened lingering in the air between them. They never spoke about it again. But years later, Mark would still hear the whisper. Mark. The same voice calling him in the darkness, never to be explained. And every time he thought back to that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching them, waiting. The second story took place in a well-known national park, a popular spot for families and groups of friends. However, for 2 backpackers, Sarah and Jake, it was supposed to be the escape they'd been longing for. They wanted to explore the wilder side of the park, away from the typical trails and crowded campsites. So, they ventured deep into the forest, far past the places where most campers dared to go. The untouched wilderness felt almost magical at first, like they were the first to ever set foot there. After setting up camp beneath towering pine trees, they huddled around the fire and talked about their adventures and the places they'd been. The forest felt peaceful, almost surreal, but there was a quiet undercurrent, a sense of something out of place. Sarah had always been sensitive to energy, and she couldn't help but feel that something was watching them from the shadows beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't the usual hum of nature that made her uneasy. It was a stillness, an unnatural silence that filled the air. As the night wore on, Jake went to bed, but Sarah stayed by the fire for a while, trying to shake the unsettling feeling in her chest. The silence grew deeper, and she began hearing faint rustling sounds in the distance. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then it became more rhythmic, almost like footsteps. She tried to convince herself that it was an animal, but the cadence was too deliberate, too consistent. Something was moving out there. She stood up, her heart pounding, and peered into the darkness. There was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shape, dark, moving between the trees. A shadow. It seemed to glide effortlessly, just outside her line of vision. She couldn't make out its exact form, but she felt its presence like a cold weight pressing down on her chest. It wasn't the kind of movement one would expect from an animal. It was too smooth, too calculated. Her instincts screamed at her to wake Jake, but she was frozen in place, her eyes locked on the shadow. The figure moved closer, its form shifting and blending with the trees, almost as if it were part of the forest itself. Then, without warning, it vanished into the woods. Sarah rushed to wake Jake, shaking him from a deep sleep. He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. "I saw something," she said, her voice trembling. "Out there. A figure. Moving through the trees. I don't know what it was, but I know I wasn't imagining it." Jake, although skeptical, agreed to stay awake with her for the rest of the night. But as they sat there, the oppressive silence returned. They could hear nothing except the crackling of the fire and their own breathing. The longer they sat in the stillness, the more aware they became of the space around them, of the dark silhouettes of the trees, stretching far beyond the light of the fire. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but Sarah couldn't shake the image of that shadow. She tried to convince herself it was just her mind playing tricks, the product of exhaustion and isolation. But when morning came and they packed up to leave, Sarah noticed something that chilled her to the bone. There were marks on the trees surrounding their campsite, deep scratches, as though something had been clawing at the bark. But the marks were higher than a person could reach, and the trees were too smooth for any animal to have made them. Something had been watching them from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. They left the forest that day, but Sarah couldn't forget the feeling of those eyes, those unseen eyes, that had watched them from the shadows. The forest seemed to swallow the memory of the shadow as soon as they left, but she knew that something was still out there, something far older and more sinister than they could ever understand. The third story begins on a trip that a group of college friends had been looking forward to for months. They were eager to disconnect from their busy lives, leave the noise of the city behind, and escape to the wilderness for a weekend of camping. The destination was a remote area known for its scenic river, which cut through dense forests and rugged terrain. It was an idyllic P. After setting up camp by the riverbank, the friends, Sarah, Tom, Lily, and Alex, spent the day hiking and fishing. The river sparkled under the late afternoon sun, and the surrounding trees formed a canopy that filtered the sunlight, casting a soft glow over the campsite. It was the kind of place you could imagine getting lost in, where the beauty of nature was. As night began to fall, they gathered around the fire, cooking their dinner and telling stories under the flickering light. The air had grown cooler, and the sound of the river was now accompanied by the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But then, as the fire burned low, Tom noticed something strange. On the opposite side of the river, just across from their campsite, there was a figure standing in the darkness. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a shadow, an illusion caused by the flickering light and the movement of the trees. But as Tom stared harder, he realized the figure was real. A man, standing perfectly still watching them. He was wearing a long dark coat and a hood that obscured his face, but his presence was undeniable. There was something unnerving about him, something that didn't belong in this tranquil setting. Tom's gaze locked on the man's figure, and his heart started to race. He thought about calling out to him, but there was something in the way the man stood that made Tom hesitate. It was as if the man was waiting for something, waiting for them to notice him. "Hey, do you see that?" Tom asked, his voice low, but the others hadn't noticed yet. Lily, sitting closest to the river's edge, looked in the direction he was pointing. "What are you talking about? I don't see anything." But Tom couldn't tear his eyes away. The figure didn't move. It was as if he were frozen in time, standing completely motionless on the other side of the river. His dark hooded head turned slightly toward them. The longer Tom stared, the more it felt like the man was looking right back at him, even though he couldn't see his eyes. "Let's just ignore it," Alex said, shrugging it off. "Maybe someone else is camping across the river. They're probably just out for a walk." But that explanation didn't sit right with Tom. The man had been standing there for too long without moving, and there was something about his stillness that felt wrong. The rest of the group went on talking, dismissing it as a trick of the light, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They finished dinner and sat around the fire, but Tom couldn't focus on the conversation. His attention kept drifting to the figure, still standing across the river, still watching. He couldn't explain it, but the sensation of being observed grew stronger. His thoughts raced as he tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps it was just some other camper, someone else enjoying the solitude of the wilderness. But something about the man's unblinking stare felt like an intrusion, like he wasn't supposed to be there. As the night wore on, the figure finally moved. But it wasn't the casual movement of a person going on a walk. It was deliberate, slow, almost unnatural. The man didn't walk across the river. He simply glided along the edge, his movement silent and smooth, as if the distance between them didn't matter. "Okay, I'm officially freaked out," Sarah said, her voice breaking the tense silence. "There's no way someone would just stand there like that for hours, and then move like that. Who is that?" But when they all looked back at the riverbank, the figure was gone. The group stood up, walking cautiously to the edge of the river, peering into the darkness. There was no sign of the man. No movement, no sound. It was as if he had never been there at all. The rest of the night passed in a strange, uneasy silence. The group tried to act as though nothing had happened, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier, as if the night itself was holding its breath. No one spoke of the figure, but they couldn't stop thinking about him, wondering if he had been real or a figment of their imagination. By morning, they packed up quickly, ready to leave the river behind. They were no longer interested in the serene beauty of the place, nor the thought of returning for another night. It wasn't just the hooded man that disturbed them. It was the feeling that, somehow, the land was alive with something they couldn't comprehend, something that could watch and wait, hidden in the shadows. Years later, Tom would return to that same river, in an attempt to face his fears. But as he stood on the banks, staring across the water, he couldn't help but wonder. What had been on the other side that night? What had been watching him, waiting for the moment he'd look away?